Good afternoon and welcome to DASNY's webinar, Higher Education Capital Matching Grant Program, Competitive Round 3 Scoring and Process for Awardees. We are ready to get started. Presenters, go ahead and unmute your line.
Thank you, Liz, and thank you everyone for joining today's webinar. My name is Sarah Richards. I have been working on the HECap program for a number of years. I've probably spoken to many of you, and I'm accompanied today by others in the Grants Administration Unit and Monica Norris, who is another attorney here at DASNY, who is in charge of overseeing the MWBE compliance portion of the grant program. We're happy to be here and hope that this is helpful to you moving forward. So there's a lot of information to cover today. We encourage you to ask questions. We'll answer those that we can if we're unable to get to all of them, or you think of something after the webinar that we didn't cover, please feel free to send us an email, and we will answer your question and post the answer on the DASNY website as well, so that others can have the benefit of learning what the answer is. We're going to go in order through 3 parts today. The first relates to the scoring of the applications. The second is the process that the awardees will now go through to access their grant funds. And the third focuses on MWBE fulfillment of those requirements and how to complete the necessary documentation. So first, we will talk about the scoring process and what we looked at, what the scoring team looked at when determining those who received a grant. So the HECap statute describes the HECap project as the acquisition, design, construction, reconstruction, rehabilitation, or equipping of a facility on or near a college campus within the state. And ineligible uses of the funds are non-capital costs, working capital, repayment of long-term debt, and we did receive a couple of applications for projects that actually were not located within the state of New York. So that is a critical component of the HECap grant program, that the public funds from the state of New York are to stay within the state of New York and benefit New Yorkers. The rest of the projects listed there haven't been a lot of changes over the years in terms of the description of an eligible HECap project. Generally, the project has to enhance programmatic offerings at the college or the student life at the college, or provide economic development benefits to the area surrounding the college campus. In terms of scoring the applications, there were 3 categories. Those of you who have applied for multiple rounds may be used to seeing more. We've narrowed it to 3: completeness of the application, eligible project, which is half of the available 100 points, and a financial review. And really what we're looking for there is to make sure that the project as described can be funded with funds that are committed to that project. The eligible project dates for the 3rd competitive round are August 1st, 2018 through August 1st, 2021. We typically get a fair number of questions regarding what activities, if any, may commence prior to that August 1st date. And the answer to that question is that design, engineering, and other preliminary planning activities, that's okay if those start prior to August 1, 2018. The grantee cannot be paid for costs incurred prior to that date out of the HECap grant funds. But if you've started the design, engineering, planning for a project in advance of that date, that's fine in terms of project eligibility. You just can't submit requisitions for reimbursement out of the grant funds. In terms of completeness of the application, this is a list of the things that our scorers were looking for, that all questions were reviewed and responded to. Surprisingly, we did get some applications where there were questions left blank. The application needs to be signed by an authorized individual who could bind the institution contractually. We needed a full, clear description of the project to be undertaken, an explanation of the reviews and approvals that remain to be secured in connection with the project, and when those approvals are expected. If the project is still in the infancy stage and it appears to be unlikely that those approvals will be obtained, that would cause a question in the scorer's mind as to whether or not there's a reasonable likelihood that the project could be completed by August of 2021. But again, that should be explained in the application, as to the relevant dates in connection with those approvals. And the Grants Reform Gateway document vault must be kept current. And that is critical that you go into that Grants Reform Gateway and verify that your vault is up to date at all times during the application and review process. In some cases where applicants fell short in this category, questions were left blank or one or two word answers were given in response to the question, which was insufficient for our team of reviewers to really mark that as a complete application. In terms of an eligible project, again, the statutory requirements are that the project enhance the programmatic offerings at the institution, provide economic development benefits to the surrounding area, or enhance student life at the institution. Projects need not have all three of these categories. They can have one, two, or three. There's no, premium put on a project that meets all three of those criteria as opposed to a project that focuses on achieving one of those goals. We were looking for a robust project description that outlined the goals that are expected to be achieved as a result of the expenditure of public dollars, confirms the time frame of the project, and really talks about the benefits to New Yorkers that the grant funds will provide. Some of the project descriptions, again, were a couple of lines. They, described only in very basic terms what the project was, with no benefits described, and very few details. And I'll just say here, because this is something that's come up relatively recently, cloud-based software, although it is something that a lot of institutions, educational and otherwise, are increasingly utilizing to accomplish their goals, cloud-based software is not a capital cost within the meaning of the Debt Reform Act and the Internal Revenue Code. So that is not a cost that is able to be paid with grant funds. So if you have, you're thinking of, a project for future rounds perhaps, just keep in mind that those licensing fees and other associated costs with cloud-based software cannot constitute a HECap project. In terms of the financial review, we are looking for a completed budget describing the sources and uses of the funds, both how the HECap grant is going to be utilized and how the 3-to-1 non-state share will be spent and where those non-state funds are coming from. And please keep in mind, our team of reviewers that we have, they're from different departments here at DASNY. There's some grant folks and people from other departments. They are only authorized to look at the materials and information included in the application itself. Don't make any, assumptions that they will go other places to ascertain whether or not the institution appears likely to have the resources to complete a project, or if your college or university perhaps does other business with DASNY, and has sent in financial information or otherwise, our reviewers are not going to access that information and review it. They're limited to the four corners of the document that's submitted. So please, do not assume that they are looking to external sources to reach conclusions about the ability of the institution to complete the project from a financial perspective. So please make sure, for future rounds that page with the financial review is completely filled out with all relevant details provided in terms of where the other sources of funding is coming from and whether or not those sources have been committed. One other thing I'll say here that tends to confuse people is, the HECap grant, it does not need to be spent equally across all lines of the project. Some folks go through, the math to figure out, how to allocate the HECap grant, proportionally to the non-state matching funds. You don't need to do that. The HECap grant can be allocated to one component of a project. It doesn't have to go across, all aspects of acquisition, construction, et cetera. We will also be looking to see whether or not there is an estimate for the project. Some applications came to us with just a number on them. The project is going to cost X, with no backup as far as whether or not that was a reasonable amount, whether it was derived from an architect's estimate or whether it came from, facility people or where it came from. It should be, explained where the estimate came from, how that number was reached before it's put in the budget. And we understand that, for some schools, you're not going to go out and pay for a detailed professional estimate until you know whether, a grant has been secured. In such cases, it's fine to go to, a facilities person, the facilities department. Maybe a similar project was undertaken a couple of years ago at the campus. You can extrapolate from that, whatever the case may be. But, if an application is submitted with no backup and no support for the project budget, it will not score as high as one that has a professional estimate behind it to justify the cost of the project. A 3-to-1 match, again, it's on the project as a whole. So again, that you can save yourself some time and effort on the math and just keep that in mind when you're completing it. And I do want to say here for those colleges and universities who have been with the program for a while, because we still get questions on it, in an early round a number of years ago, there was a provision for a waiver of the 3-to-1 match requirement. That provision no longer exists. There are no waivers to the 3-to-1 match requirement. So choose a project accordingly. That may result in the college or university undertaking a smaller project, so that you can access the requisite 3-to-1 non-state matching funds. But just keep that in mind. And again, if a recurring source of revenue exists, be sure to state that is available to continue to provide maintenance and support for the project on an ongoing basis. We wouldn't want to put public dollars into a project only to have the school find out a couple of years down the road that it's unable to be maintained. Matching requirements. I think this is going to be familiar information to lots of you. Bank account, investment account statements, pledges, loan agreements, bond documents, personal service contracts, bills of sale and paid invoices. Those are really the primary sources that we see. In-kind contributions, we don't see that very much. Those are harder to quantify. And if the institution will be using institution funds for any part of the non-state match, we'll ask to see your most recent audited financial statement. And for all of these categories, I'll say, in addition to what I previously indicated, that don't assume that the reviewers know more about the financial status of your institution other than what's on paper. We will need something more than, don't just include a bank account statement alone, without noting that the funds there are unrestricted, they're able to be used for purposes of the project, and it should be accompanied by a letter from an authorized official committing to use those funds for purposes of the project. We have in the past received in applications, institutions will just include, a statement with no explanation or other forms with, dollar amounts on them without saying anything more than that. And, we're not always sure what conclusions to draw from that, but, our reviewers are instructed they can't, in and of itself make assumptions about the financial situation of any institution other than what is provided in the application and described. So that is an overview of the completeness, eligible project, and financial sections of the review. We have not received any questions that have come in. So I'll pause just a little bit. If anybody does have questions, feel free to submit them. And while we're waiting for the next, for that to happen and the next section, I will say one of the questions that we have heard frequently from applicants in this round as well as potential applicants in the next round is, when will the next competitive round request for grant applications become available? We don't have that information yet, but as soon as we know when that will be posted, we will send everyone an email using the email address we have on file. If you've had any changes or will have changes to the contact information, please do let us know. But other than that, I don't have any additional information as to when that can be expected.
Just as a reminder, to submit any questions, at the bottom of your screen there are a number of buttons. Click on the button with the 3 ellipses and the Q&A function will appear.
Okay, so thank you for listening to this section. There is the email address on your screen now for where email questions can be submitted. So moving on to the next section, review of the process for those applicants who have received a grant. The relevant dates, you're probably all familiar with those. Awards were approved by the HECap board at their last meeting this summer. And I will say here, right off the bat, please, if you have a consultant or other professional working for the college or university, and you would like them to speak to us on your behalf, we need to have an email or other written permission from the contact person listed at the college or university to talk to that individual. So, if there are 3 people at the college and university plus an outside consultant that you have authorized us to speak with, just make sure that we have their name and affiliation on file, because otherwise we won't talk to somebody who calls to ask about the grant that your institution has been awarded. So July 30th, 2019, that was the date that the HECap board announced awards to this request for grant application. We have sent out award letters to those grantees and requested some additional information in order to move forward with our review. And that information, as a reminder, was a project update, including budget and timeline. We understand that construction budgets change, so please do not worry if the budget and timeline looks a little different than it did at the time you first applied. a W-9 grantee certification, project certification, and site control documentation. And this is all required so that our bond and tax counsel can reach a determination that the grant can be paid ultimately from bond proceeds issued by DASNY. The incorporation papers, or most likely the charter in the case of HECap grantees, and construction contracts, which must now contain Appendix B, which was sent to you. In the past, we were able to get those contracts approved if there was language in the contracts that approximated that in Appendix B, and now to make sure there is no delay and no holdup for grantees at any stage of the process, your construction contracts need to contain that appendix. And that Appendix B, for ease of accessing it, we'll also post that on the DASNY website so you can get a copy of it. The other information that we need that Monica will be talking about in a little bit is the MWBE information, which consists of Exhibit F1, a utilization plan or waiver request, as well as updated workers' comp coverage and proof of disability benefits forms. If there's any other information that we need based on review of that information, we will let you know. And if we, again, we know it's quite a packet of information. We would like it back as soon as possible so that we can move forward with processing your grant so you can get your grant funds. If, however, that's not possible for you to do that for one reason or another, please just send us an email and let us know if you won't be able to provide that by October 15th. It won't be held against you. We would just like to have an idea about when we can expect it, and if certainly if there's anything we can do to help complete those documents, or you have questions on them, please do let us know so that we can plan accordingly. Again, in terms of the items that we will need to verify are completed, the grants reform gateway. This was part of an initiative back a number of years ago that the state implemented to transform business practices in the state of New York to streamline grants processing. And one of the things that was implemented in connection with that was the pre-qualification process through the grants reform gateway. So there's certain documents, you're probably all aware, that need to be uploaded to the gateway and kept current in order to maintain eligibility for state contracts, including grants. If you have any questions or problems with that, feel free to let us know. But that status of pre-qualified will need to be maintained throughout the process, including throughout the payment process when OSC actually issues payment based upon our review and approval of requisitions. The vendor responsibility questionnaire, that is a New York State Office of the State Controllers questionnaire that many of you have seen. You can enroll there in the VendRep system, and this will be posted, this presentation, as Liz mentioned, will be posted on our website, but the email address, or the link rather, is there, so you can enroll and complete those diligence documents for yourself and also any contracts with any vendor that will be paid more than $100,000 of HECap funds will have to maintain that as well. Site control, we need to verify that the institution has sufficient authorization and control to undertake the project at the project location. For most institutions, that's going to be a deed. For some, the projects take place in lease space. Whatever means you are operating at a particular location, we will need to have that site control. If grant funds will be used to purchase real property, which I know is the case for some grantees, we are going to need to see the contract of sale with evidence that all contingencies have been satisfied. along with an appraisal that meets certain requirements. So if your grant is for the acquisition of real property, we will put you in contact with professionals from our real property unit here at DASNY who will be the ones reviewing the appraisal. They may have questions about it, but in any event, to the extent that there's an appraisal, say, for $200,000 and you pay $300,000 for the property because it's a parcel that you need, we will only be able to authorize the expenditure of grant funds for up to the appraised amount. The other factors here, these are forms. I won't read through them all, but the forms evidencing, workers' comp coverage, disabilities benefits coverage, those will need to be provided as well before we can move forward with finalizing review of your project. The next thing is a grantee certification. This verifies that the space to be improved and the use of the funds will not be used to make improvements that essentially finance religious programs or may favor one religion over another. And that certification will need to be executed by 2 individuals authorized to bind the institution. So one question this might be our most frequently asked question in terms of what constitutes equipment versus construction, and that obviously impacts whether or not prevailing wage has to be paid. So we made this chart. Obviously, this is not necessarily a black and white issue, but if your project is for components that are integral to a facility, elevators, HVAC, those are not equipment. Those are part of a construction project, and a construction contract is required, and the project must meet all MWBE prevailing wage requirements and include Appendix B, as previously discussed. I'll jump down to the third line on that chart. Movable equipment with no construction, microscopes, tables, chairs, computers, equipment that may be used, in a nursing school, in a simulation lab, things of that nature. No construction contract is necessary for those. Those are clearly movable equipment, and no prevailing wage, et cetera. The middle category is a little tougher and really requires sort of a case-by-case examination. If it's equipment that requires some construction, but the construction is, incidental to the purchase of the equipment, again, it really will have to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. And, if there's a telescope that requires a bigger door, a hole in the roof, hoods being installed in a science lab, which requires some protrusion into the ceiling, it really is going to depend on the nature of the construction to be undertaken in comparison to, the equipment. If it's, widening a little space that's done by your facilities folks to accommodate a hood, that, not construction, but, if it's raising a roof and increasing openings and, relocating a window to put in some piece of equipment that is large, then that may require a construction contract that has all those other requirements we previously talked about. So if you have a specific situation that you'd like to talk in more detail about, we would be happy to engage with you on, sort of a one-to-one basis and try to sort that out. But, yeah, a lot of times you probably have an idea whether or not it's primarily construction or probably primarily equipment, but we'd be happy to, help you work through that and bounce ideas off. So as far as construction contracts go, as you know, it's required as part of the legislation that in order to access these HECap grant funds, the institution has to comply with certain provisions of state law that it might not otherwise be required to comply with. And that includes the payment of prevailing wage and compliance with Article 15A of the Executive Law, which contain the MWBE provisions. So keep that in mind. Unfortunately, we have had situations where colleges have applied for and been awarded a grant, and then after the contract is signed, we find out that the college either didn't pay prevailing wage, or the estimate maybe was developed without taking into account that prevailing wage would have to be paid, and all of a sudden there's a shortage of funds. It is unfortunate when that happens, and believe me, we feel badly about that here when it happens that an institution is not able to actually access the grant that has been awarded. We do not have any discretion in this area, however, since it is a statutory requirement that you have to comply with these provisions. So please, moving forward, if you have questions, please ask in advance, but otherwise the entire project, must, comply with these provisions. Prevailing wage has to be paid on the entire HECap project. MWBE has to be complied with for the entire project, and Monica will talk a little more about that. So just keep that in mind. We don't have the ability to waive any of those requirements. The construction contracts need to include Appendix B, and we are not going to be able to move forward, anything other than a contract with that appendix. So signed proposals, work orders, any other indicia that compliance with those provisions was satisfied will not be accepted by the Attorney General. The contract will not be approved. So just make sure that you are compliant with these provisions, or it unfortunately may cause problems down the road. And then Exhibit F1, the MWBE Utilization Plan and Request for Waiver. Those must be completed and approved by DASNY as part of the review process. An environmental review for those projects where a municipality completed a seeker review. You can provide us either with a finding statement or the negative declaration that was undertaken by the seeker lead agency, or if that means nothing to you and you have no idea what I'm talking about, please just let us know, and we will put our environmental manager in contact with the relevant people to find out whether such review has occurred. If your project is not being reviewed by a municipality or other lead agency, DASNY will undertake that seeker review and any other environmental reviews that are required. Typically, that would require the completion of an environmental assessment form and any other documentation that may be required if the building is historic or there's going to be some kind of impact to historic buildings. And typically, we have not had a lot of holdups in the past with those environmental review processes. It tends not to be as much of an issue on, college campuses, since the area is defined and typically zoned as such. But it is something we need to comply with as a matter of law, so it is an important factor that needs to be taken into account moving forward. If you're in New York City and your project was the subject of a ULURP review, which is the Uniform Land Use Review Procedure, please get us that documentation as well. And again, once we see that, we will make sure an environmental manager gets in contact to get all the details that we need in order to move forward. The financial review, I talked about before, we'll need a professional estimate. Please just don't put a number on the budget and think that that's all we'll need. We will need something from a facilities person, a design professional, something describing how the bottom line was reached. The 3-to-1 match, as I said, is on a project as a whole. It doesn't have to be on each task. And please do keep in mind that the HECap grant can only be used for capital costs. No lease payments, no utility payments. it can't be used for storage space if you're planning to store equipment in the midst of a renovation of a floor. Moving costs, things like that are not capital in nature and can't be paid with the grant funds. Again, this is similar to what we talked about before in terms of what constitutes committed funding resources. We do just need to make sure that the funds that you set forth are able and committed for use for that HECap project. So once we get through all those reviews, we will forward a grant disbursement agreement to the institution for signature. That will need to be executed by an authorized officer and returned to us along with an opinion of counsel, which basically provides a legal opinion that the person executing that agreement is authorized to do so. When DASNY gets those grant disbursement agreements back, we review them, make sure everything is in order, and then we will route them through the signature process to have a representative of the HECap board execute the agreement, as well as the Attorney General and the Office of the State Controller, and one fully executed agreement will be returned to the institution at that point. We will then coordinate going forward with the Attorney General to approve the contracts to the extent that you don't have them at the time of the grant disbursement agreement, so that they approve each contract, and we will work with you on that. Our grants unit has worked on a number of these contracts over the years with many grantees and is very familiar with the requirements of the Attorney General and are happy to help you figure out what documentation you need to provide to us. And again, we coordinate all that with the Attorney General. It's not something that you'll do on your own. Your communication in that regard will be with DASNY. Once the agreements are fully executed, the requisitions can be submitted to DASNY's Accounts Payable Department. Our department will review the requisitions, verify that the backup information is there, reach out to you with any questions that they have or requests for additional documentation. Just keep in mind that the Office of the State Controller will be the entity actually making payments. These payments are made out of the state system, so reimbursements will come not from DASNY, but from the state of New York. And typically, a lot of people ask about the timing for that. We will typically turn around our approval within 4 to 6 weeks at the outside, and then once the submission to the Office of the State Controller is made requesting payment, they typically turn that around within a few business days. So that process is relatively quick. So that is it for that section. The last portion of our webinar today will be on the completion of the MWBE documentation. So I will turn it over at this point to Monica Norris of our counsel's office. And then if any other questions come to mind between now and the end of the webinar, you can send them in to us, and we'll do our best, time permitting, to answer them before the end of our call.
Hi, my name is Monica Norris, and I will walk you through the MWBE requirements for this grant. Now, as you're aware, and as Sarah mentioned earlier, the HECap legislation requires compliance with New York State Executive Law, Article 15A. And basically what Article 15A does, it promotes the utilization of minorities and women-owned businesses on state contracts. Now, 15A requires that we set goals on the contract. And in this instance, we've set a goal of 18% for the use of minority-owned businesses and 12% for women-owned businesses. Now, this is on any grant award that's in excess of $100,000 for construction-related services, or $25,000 for the purchase of commodities. So if it's a construction-related project and it's over $100,000, you are required to comply with Article 15A. Now, you may actually exceed the 18 and 12% requirement on the grant, but what you cannot do is fall below those percentages without proper justification, which I'll discuss later. Now, in order to monitor MWBE compliance on this grant, we require that you complete two documents and for approval. The first one is the utilization plan, and the second one is a request for waiver. Now, the first document we'll review is the MWBE utilization plan. And the utilization plan is pretty much broken into three separate sections, and all sections must be completed. The first section requires you to provide information regarding your institution. So this is the grantee's information, name, address, etc. Now, Section B relates to the project information. It requires your project ID number, which is the HECap project ID number. You'll also see that we request that you provide us with the project amount as well as the grant award. Now, I'd like to point out here that when you complete the utilization plan, the 18% and 12% goals that we've established, we will monitor those with respect to the grant award. So if you received a grant of $500,000 from DASNY, that number would be provided in the project amount. If you're in the grant award, I'm sorry. If the project is $1 million, then the $1 million would be provided in the project amount. But with respect to the $500,000 grant award, we ask that you complete the utilization plan that reflects 18% and 12% MWBE youth with respect to the $500,000. So that's the grant award. Now, as Sarah mentioned earlier, you're required to comply with Article 15A on the project per the legislation. So the certifications that you will provide will pretty much state that you are complying with Article 15A on the entire project, but keep in mind we will monitor with respect to utilization, with respect to the utilization plan, the grant award. So we'll ask you to provide the names of the vendors as well as the dollar amounts to equal 18 and 12% for the grant award. Okay, so that was Section A and also Section B of the utilization plan. Now, Section C is where you're required to list the names of the vendors as well as the value of the proposed award contract that will be awarded to the vendors. Now, it is important to keep in mind that only New York State certified minority or women-owned business enterprises will count toward meeting your goals. So there are some entities that have been certified by other organizations. New York City, for example, does provide certifications to minority and women-owned business enterprises, but only those enterprises that are certified by the New York State Economic Development will count towards meeting the goals. And you'll see in the second bullet that we provided the link to the New York State website. And when you click on that link, you'll be directed to ESD, Empire State Development, and you can access a list of MWBE firms that are actually certified by New York State. Also, another thing I'd like to point out with respect to the utilization plan, you will see that you're required to check whether or not the firm will be utilized by your institution as either an MBE or a WBE. So we ask that you not check both boxes. You check either an MBE or a WBE. One firm may not be used to fulfill both requirements. So if you have XYZ Contracting, and they receive dual certification from ESD, because it does happen. A firm can be certified as both an M and a W. You can only use that firm to meet one or the other requirement, not both. All Alrighty, and you'll see at the last bullet we say that if your organization will be requesting a total waiver, you leave this particular section blank, which is section C, and return this form with your waiver request. So this is pretty much utilization plan. If you will be using MWBE firms, then you complete sections A, B, and C, and you will have someone who's authorized to sign on behalf of your organization sign this document and submit it to us. Now, the numbers that are listed in section C, the dollar amounts, should equal the 18 and 12% goals that you're required to meet. Now, if you're not meeting the goals, or if you're requesting a total or partial waiver, which I'll discuss in a minute, you're still required to complete sections A and B of the utilization plan, and you will sign, someone should sign the document and date it and submit it along with the waiver. So the next document that I'll discuss is the waiver, and this is completed in the event that you are unable to fully meet the MWBE goals. Either you may get either a total waiver or partial waiver. Now, you'll see sections A and B in the request for waiver. They're pretty much the same as those sections are in the utilization plan. The first section A requires the grantee's information, and section B requires information regarding the project. Now, section C on the waiver is different. Now, keep in mind, with respect to section B, where it asks for the goal amount, the percentage, it's always 18% and 12%. Even if you're meeting only a partial part of the goal, if you're meeting 10%, those numbers will never change. They remain 18 and 12. Now, section C, you complete that section, again, if you're requesting a waiver. So, if you're unable to meet any of the goals, you're not able to find MWBE vendors, no M's for the 18% or W firm for the 12%, then you would check C1 would be a total waiver, and you would also check the total waiver for the M and the W. Now, if you're able to meet part of the goal, so for example, the goal is 18% for the minority firm, and you're able to meet 10% of the goals, then you would request a partial waiver, and you would check the box that requests a partial waiver, whether it's either for the minority firm, the woman-owned firm, or both. Alrighty, so on the next slide, we talk a little bit about section C. So A and B requires project and grantee information. In section C, we ask that you, number 3, you must provide a justification as to why you're requesting a waiver, because a waiver will only be granted if you can provide justification, and you must show good faith efforts that you've pretty much tried everything that you can to obtain minority or women-owned business enterprise participation on the project, but for whatever reasons you were unable to do so. Alrighty, so on the next slide, let's talk a little about the statement of justification. Now, we have section C. It's a very small section. Some grantees have included additional pages, for example, to explain the reasons why they're requesting a waiver of the goals. You may do so, and you just indicate in number 3 that see attached or justification attached, or what I prefer that you do is provide maybe a brief summary in section 3, because you will receive that along with the utilization plan, and in a separate, on a separate sheet of paper, you can go ahead and elaborate on that justification if you need to. Again, both the utilization plan and the waiver must be signed by someone who's authorized to do so on behalf of your institution. Now, as I stated before, a waiver of the goals, whether it's a total waiver or a partial waiver of the goals, will only be granted if you can demonstrate that you have exercised good faith efforts in meeting the goals. And what constitutes good faith efforts? Well, we've pretty much set those out for you here on this particular slide. And these requirements pretty much come directly from regulations that are promulgated by New York State, Empire State Development under Article 15A. So these requirements are pretty much standard. And what we look for is that, for example, if you have a project and you need MWBE participation, you can visit the ESD website, which is the Empire State Development, and they are required to maintain a list of MWBE firms in different fields. So you can do a search of the website to find different firms that in different areas. If you or your contractors are familiar with MWBE firms, minority women business-owned enterprises, and have done work with these firms in the past, you can directly solicit from these firms. Another way of obtaining participation or exercising good faith efforts would be, for example, to publish or advertise in a newspaper or similar of general circulation, or those journals or publications that are targeted to minority-owned business enterprises or women-owned business enterprises. Or another thing that can be done is that you can, for example, if you have a large project and you can sort of break it down into smaller projects in order to sort of encourage MWBE participation, that's another thing that we can look for. And keep in mind, though, that MWBE participation is not limited to the general contractor. So if you're not able to locate MWBE firms on the general project, subcontractors, suppliers, et cetera, will be counted towards meeting those goals. So this is a requirement that we sort of recommend that you pass on to your general contractor and have them include these requirements in their solicitation documents so that they may obtain through subcontracting work MWBE participation. And you may list those subcontracting those subcontractors, suppliers, et cetera, on the utilization plan. What we require is that I believe when you submit your requisitions, you'll just have to be able to demonstrate that payments were actually made to the subcontractors and suppliers that are listed on the utilization plan. So if you're not able to do so, as I said, general contractors, subcontractors, suppliers, et cetera, feel free to include those vendors on the utilization plan. Now, you provided us with justification and why you should probably obtain a waiver of the goals. But in addition to the justification statement, we also require that you provide us with documentation that supports your good faith efforts. For example, if your justification, you include that you've searched the New York State website for your area for a particular, in a particular field, but you were unable to locate MWBE vendors, then we would request that you provide us with a list of the names, that if there were any names that pop up, the search term, when you search the website, et cetera. If you published in a newspaper or journal of general circulation, then we ask that you provide us with a list of that publication also. If, for example, you state in your justification that you emailed a list of vendors that were located on the New York State website, but no one responded to your solicitation, we ask that you provide us with copies of those emails. If your contact with the MWBE vendors was a verbal contact, then we ask that you provide us with the name of the contact, and if you can, the date and when you solicited, and what the response was from this particular vendor. If, for example, you'll let us know that you reached out to an MWBE vendor, they responded to the solicitation, however, their response was much higher than the next lowest response, then we ask you to provide us with the MWBE vendor's response and how it compares to the the response that you actually awarded the contract. So this is just a sampling of what we require. You of course can provide, any other documentation that you have or that you believe will support your request for a waiver of the goals. And like I said, emails to the MWBE vendors, list of contacts, list that was pulled from the ESD, Empire State Development's website, to show that you actually solicited from the vendors. And you're also required to explain, if MWBE vendors responded, why they were not selected. And if you have responses in writing from the MWBE firms, we ask that you provide those too. Pretty much on this slide is what I just pretty much said. So anything you deem relevant that will support your request for a waiver, we ask that you provide that. Now, we've gotten the question, in those instances where the grantee has not yet gone out to bid, has not yet issued solicitation documents, because the MWBE Utilization Plan requires that you include a list of vendors that will be used on the project. So if you have not yet gone out to bid, how do you complete a utilization plan and provide it to us? Well, what we require in those instances is that we do require that you submit a utilization plan, because the grant award will not proceed until you have an approved utilization plan and or waiver. Now, if you have not yet gone out to bid, we of course cannot grant you a waiver, because in order to get a waiver, you must be able to demonstrate your good faith efforts. So what we require is that you submit a utilization plan. So we ask that you reach out to the MWBE community, because at this point you should, or I'm assuming that you do know, the types of work that you will be soliciting on a particular project. You can explain the situation to them if you so choose, and assess their ability, interest, and capability. You can pretty much explain to them you have a project that will begin in, or you'll be going out with solicitations in another 6 months, 5 months, etc., and you're listing them whether they would be willing to bid on that particular project. Just assess pretty much their availability and their capabilities. Then you complete the utilization plan and include those firms on the utilization plan. Now, at any time, you may amend the utilization plan. So, for example, you submit a utilization plan because you have not yet gone out to bid. The utilization was approved. You eventually issue a solicitation. The vendors that are listed on the approved utilization plan, 1, did not respond to the solicitation. 2, they might have responded, but for whatever reasons they were not selected, because maybe they came in too high, or for whatever reasons now you have to amend the utilization plan. We do allow you to amend the utilization plan. So if, for example, they come in, now this also helps too, for example, if you went out to bid and now you have to change utilization plan because the vendors on the original plans were not selected. This actually helps you if you, at that time, have to now request a waiver, because now you can demonstrate the good faith efforts. You had initially reached out to these MWBE firms. They had expressed interest in bidding on the project, but when you actually went out to bid, they either did not bid or they came in too high. So, and that's pretty much what we allow in those instances. And even if you have not yet gone out to bid and you're completing a utilization plan, we ask that you include the value of the proposed contract. I really understand that you're not, exactly sure at that particular time how much a particular vendor will receive, but that's pretty much how we determine if at any point you will be able to meet the 18 and 12% goals. So we do ask that you complete the value of the proposed award. Now, once you've submitted the utilization plan and or waivers, and those have been approved, you will receive a determination letter stating that either the utilization plan has been accepted or that you've received a waiver of the goals. And you'll see on the screen, we've provided samples of the types of letters that we will send to you. Now, attached to those letters, you will see the MWBE compliance report, and you're required to submit those, and the instructions are provided in those, the award letters that we send out. But the MWBE compliance report pretty much helps us in tracking your MWBE use. Now, you'll notice that if, for example, you've received a total waiver of the goals, you can check the first box, and then you would not be required to list the MWBE vendors on this particular form. So you only check that box if you've received a total waiver. If you've received a partial waiver, only a partial waiver, there are no boxes for you to check, you must still complete this particular compliance report and submit it along with your requisition. And that's pretty much what I have. Are there any questions regarding the MWBE participation?
So there was a question on here regarding who completes the F1 and F2, and is it a correct statement in saying the college or university needs to complete that, not the contractor?
Well, technically speaking, yes, but it's completed by the colleges or universities. Now, grantees can have the contractors complete the information if they've, delegated that to the contractor, but ultimately the college or university must sign it and submit it to us. It cannot be signed by the contractor. And the information that's provided, I think, in Section A is that of the college or university, not the contractor's information.
And we had another question about when will the compliance report be sent, and is it a correct statement in saying that the compliance report will be sent once you review the MWBE documentation and can grant a waiver or approval on the utilization plan?
That's correct. You will receive the letter stating that your utilization plan and or waiver has been approved, and the compliance report will be attached to that letter.
Pretty much it.
Great. Well, thank you all for participating in the webinar. I hope that it was helpful and gave you an idea of how to complete a successful application, how to move forward through the review process, and how to complete the documents required in connection with the MWBE review. Again, if you have any questions that you would like to email in, the email address is on the screen, HECapRFPcoordinator@dasne.org. And again, as Liz mentioned at the outset, this webinar was recorded. It will be posted on the DASNE website if you would like to go back to it for future reference. And enjoy the rest of your afternoon.